Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see a few people are logging in now. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jonathan Millard. I'm a museum educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. I'm so happy you are able to join us today. Feel free to write in the comments below if you are watching live, where you are watching and visiting us from. Today, we're going to have a 45-minute long program, and we're going to be discussing highlights of the Intrepid Museum. Specifically, we're going to be talking about highlights of our space collection at the museum today. So all of these live streams, which you are now a part of at this moment, are free. If you would like to support us as we continue to do these, please look in the links below to do so. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, I think we're about ready to get started. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write them in the comments below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoy this program. So let's get started. So today we're going to be talking highlights of the Intrepid Museum. If you are not already familiar, this is Intrepid. So we see two photographs of Intrepid here. If you look at the photo on the left and the photo on the right, you might notice a few things are different. That first photo shows Intrepid during its time of service. Intrepid served for 31 years in 3 different wars: World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And Intrepid is a museum today where you can learn all about its collections of people who served and learn about sea, air, and space. And today we're going to be discussing space a bit. So the Intrepid Museum is located on the Hudson River in New York City. You can see in this photograph here, we have lovely New York City to the right, lovely New Jersey to the left. And if you look amongst all these small vessels here, you can actually see this very large vessel, Intrepid. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to use a platform called Google Arts and Culture to tour around the museum. So I'm going to use this platform to actually click us around. You can actually see some buildings over here. That's New York City. If we turn around, we can actually see the inside of the museum. So if we were to walk around, this is for the most part what we would see. The museum has gone through some renovations through this time. So this lovely information desk would actually be to your left, and some additional exhibits would be at the ship as well. So I want to take us to look at a small model of the ship, because Intrepid is very, very large. It's kind of hard to get the scale, the idea of how large it is and what's really going on with the ship by seeing it so big. So we're going to look at a small model to get an idea of the ship. So feel free to write in the comments what you're noticing as we're looking at this model here. Some of our visitors may notice we see a straight flight deck here, which is a little different from what we're used to seeing today on Intrepid. This is what Intrepid looked like when it was first built, when it was released in 1943. So Intrepid started to be built in December 1941. The reason the United States wanted to build the ship in December 1941 is because the United States was very concerned over Germany invading countries in Europe. They're also concerned of the nation of Japan and its growing navy. And they wanted to make sure the United States had enough ships to defend itself in case something happened. Well, something did happen. On December 7th, 1941, so 6 days after they started building Intrepid, the United States was attacked by Japan. It was attacked by Japan, a place called Pearl Harbor. Now the United States wanted to go to war against the nation of Japan. So this ship, Intrepid, was expedited. So a ship as large as Intrepid normally takes 3 whole years to build. Intrepid was actually built in less than 2 years, in about 18 months, to get it ready to fight against Japan in the Pacific. So Intrepid fought in World War II. After World War II, the United States was not really sure what they were going to do with this ship. There was questions, should we decommission it? What should be the next step? So the United States started to have more rising tension with the Soviet Union. So the Cold War began. And what was going on with the Intrepid here, its first role during the Cold War was to actually look for enemy submarines. But the ship didn't look like this while it was doing that. This is what Intrepid looked like during World War II. It needed some upgrades. So Intrepid received some upgrades. You might notice some changes here. Feel free to write in the comments what you notice is different about this ship here. I'm noticing an angled flight deck. Instead of one solid runway, there's actually a runway for aircraft to land and a runway for aircraft to take off. And then we can also see here, there's a different type of aircraft on the ship. So we actually see these are jet aircraft that Intrepid can now house. The elevators also changed on the ship. You also might notice there is not those camouflage markings on the side of the ship. Radar technology improved significantly during the Cold War. So you don't really need to have that camouflage marking that Intrepid had before. And Intrepid also played another role during the Cold War that was not just looking for submarines. And that's going to be our focus for today. Because Intrepid is now a sea, air, and space museum. By looking at the ship, you can probably get an idea why it's a sea museum. We have a ship here, right? You also might have an idea why it's an air museum, because Intrepid is an aircraft carrier. We have a wide collection featuring several different types of aircraft that span different decades. But an example here is our World War II era aircraft, the Avenger, right here. So Intrepid is an air museum because there are aircraft on board. But some people wonder why we're a space museum. We have some students that come for our programs early on that wonder if the ship itself went to space, if rockets launched off of the flight deck. And that is not how Intrepid is involved in space. And that's what we're going to uncover today, what Intrepid's connection to space is. And we're going to see some of Intrepid's space-themed collection items today. So to talk about Intrepid's involvement with space, we have to talk about two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. So I mentioned this Cold War before. So the Cold War is a little different from wars that took place prior to. So instead of it being a hot war, the Cold War was fought a little differently. Instead of the Soviet Union directly attacking the United States or the United States directly attacking the Soviet Union, these countries were competing with their ideas. And they wanted to prove to the world that the rest of the world should kind of follow their ideas. And they did this in a few different ways, by showing off, by finding out what the other country was doing, and assisting other parts of the world to convince them that they should be more sided with the United States or be more sided with the Soviet Union. One way that the United States and Soviet Union competed was through the space race. So we're going to play a little game right now called the space race game. I'm going to ask the question, and it's going to be who did it first. So I'm going to give an example. So United States and Soviet Union, they want to show the entire world that they were better than the other country. So one day, the Soviet Union put something into space, a satellite by the name of Sputnik. And Sputnik was about the size of a basketball. So feel free to think of how big a basketball is. Just put it right in front of you. This was how large this satellite was. And this satellite would orbit around the Earth, and you could actually hear beeping noises on the radio. You could hear something on the radio. Think how the American people might have felt during this time, hearing something, an object, a metal object going around the Earth. Shortly after, the United States released a nuclear weapon on another country. Think about this, right? So the United States people at home were a little concerned that there was a metal object there. So what the satellite was doing was just orbiting the planet, but people were concerned that it could be spying on the United States, that it could be a weapon. And this sparked off the space race, where the United States said, maybe we should really get way more involved with space because the Soviet Union is doing this. We need to compete in some way. So we're going to play a little game. I'm going to ask a question, who did it first? So United States or Soviet Union? If you think you know the answer, just point. You just point at the answer, or feel free to write it in the comments below. So my first question is, who do we think put the first animal in orbit? Feel free to point at the answer you think is correct. Is it United States or was it the Soviet Union? All right, and the answer is the Soviet Union put the first animal in orbit. So the very first animal ever brought into space were just fruit flies. But we want to talk about orbit. So actually getting an animal to go up into space and orbit the planet. And the very first animal, yeah, Aaron's got it. Aaron from Facebook mentioned Soviet Union, a dog by the name of Laika orbited the planet first. That was the Soviet Union that did this. The animal that the United States was able to bring up into space into orbit was a chimpanzee by the name of Ham, which I believe if anyone has a chimpanzee, I think Ham is an amazing name for that chimpanzee. All right. My next question for you, friends, is who did it first? Who brought the first man in space? Not just orbit, the first man in space. You can point over to the answer or write it down. And the answer is the Soviet Union. So Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union was the first man in space. And he was also the first man to orbit. So while the United States was working on their space technology, our first two space missions, actually with astronauts on board, did not actually orbit the planet. So it did not actually orbit the planet. But afterwards, the United States started to orbit. But the very first time Soviet Union sent a man into space, he also orbited the planet. So my next question is the first woman in space. Who do we think brought the first woman in space? The United States or was it the Soviet Union? All right, and the answer is the Soviet Union. So some of us may be familiar with the name Sally Ride, an amazing American astronaut that went up into space in 1985, went to the 1980s. But the Soviet Union sent a woman by the name of Valentina Tereshkova up into space 20 years prior. So the Soviet Union sent the first woman in space. So we said we're in a space race. So I want us all to think about the point of a race. Or how do we know a race is completed, right? There's a finish line in mind. So some of us may already know what that finish line was. So in 1961 is when the United States really determined, hey, this is going to be the finish line. The finish line would be the moon. The United States was planning to send an astronaut safely to the moon and back. So that is going to be our finish line for the race. But so I'm noticing Soviet Union is winning all these other steps though, and that is concerning. So my next question for us is which country had the first astronaut walk outside of their spacecraft for the first time? Had extravehicular activity or EVA. And the answer is, you can point at the answer or write it in the chat. The Soviet Union. First extravehicular activity with Alexei Leonov was the first cosmonaut to leave his spacecraft and walk outside in space. And that spacewalk took about 12 minutes. So I would like to spend 12 minutes floating around in space. I think that'd be a fun time. So all these steps, we're noticing that Soviet Union keeps winning and winning and winning. So I'm going to ask one more question to us, friends. And that is, which country put the first humans on the moon? Which country put the first humans on the moon? You can point at the answer or write it in the chat. And the answer is the United States. There we go, friends. So United States won the race. If you go to Russia today, they might tell you something different. But in the United States, we say United States won that space race by sending astronauts to the surface of the moon and back. So this didn't all just take place over the course of the very first time the United States was going up into space, right? So the United States needed to practice this. And Intrepid played a role in that. So let's take a look at this object over here, because this is going to play a major part in this. So this object that we're looking at here is a space capsule. And this is the very first type of space capsule the United States made as they were sending astronauts up into space. So this is a Mercury space capsule. And just looking at the size of it, feel free to write in the chat how many people do you think could fit inside of this? How many people would fit comfortably inside of this space capsule? This is actually a replica of a space capsule that we have. Intrepid does not have an actual Mercury or Gemini space capsule. We have a Soyuz space capsule, which we'll show in a bit, and we have an actual space shuttle. So comfortably inside of this space capsule, one astronaut could fit inside. So this is the very first step of the United States space program. So we're just going to have one astronaut inside. So the astronaut that is tied to Intrepid's story goes by the name of Scott Carpenter, because astronauts, we know, blast off into space, and then they have to come back down. So we see an image of a space capsule blasting off, and then we see an image here of a space capsule in space. But then we have to think about how these space capsules are actually going to come back down to the Earth and be retrieved, and those astronauts will have a nice, safe landing. So I want us to think about how long we think it might take to just go up into space and come back down, because that is what these Mercury space capsules are doing. They're just going up and coming right back down at first. First, they're just going up and right back down. And that trip takes about 15 minutes to go up into space and come right back down. Believe it or not, just 15 minutes, because space is only about 62 miles up above Earth's surface. So it doesn't take that much time for the astronauts to go up, take some time to acclimate to the space environment, and come right back down. So that's what the first space missions involved. But then we need to have these astronauts land safely back on Earth. So these astronauts would actually land in the water. So we see this large parachute open up, a lovely splash down here, and we're seeing astronauts, in this case, astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young, who I will talk about in just a bit, being retrieved out of their space capsule. So something interesting about Scott Carpenter, who was inside of this space capsule Mercury, he was the second American astronaut to go on an orbit. The first American astronaut to go on an orbit around Earth was John Glenn. If you are familiar with the film Hidden Figures, that focuses on the challenges of bringing astronaut John Glenn up into space and in orbit around the Earth. So we're looking at the Mercury space capsule here. And Scott Carpenter actually experienced some trouble on his way back down. That's because as you're orbiting around the Earth, you're going 17,500 miles per hour around the Earth. That is very, very fast. So they have to stop at a very specific, start descending back to Earth at a very specific time to be able to land at the exact area where they have to land. So Scott Carpenter took a few more seconds to enter descent than he had planned. And because he took a few more seconds, he ended up landing 250 miles away from where his intended landing spot was. 250 miles away. So this was very concerning because Intrepid especially, whose job was to retrieve Scott Carpenter, did not hear word from him. They weren't really sure what was going on. They were worried that they lost Scott Carpenter. But they actually found out that he was just floating along out in the Caribbean Ocean. Out in the Caribbean, just waiting to be picked up. So a helicopter went to retrieve Scott Carpenter, and although his capsule was retrieved by another ship, Scott Carpenter made his way back to Intrepid. So we see an image of a helicopter picking up an astronaut here. And we can see the space capsules are retrieved with a big crane. So that is what ships like Intrepid do to retrieve the space capsule. In Scott Carpenter's case, he was just retrieved by that helicopter and brought on the ship, and another ship picked up his space capsule. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've covered so far about Scott Carpenter, about space capsules, the Mercury program, or the space race? Feel free to ask any questions you may have before I move to the next part of the presentation. All right, if we don't have any questions, so I'll move on to the next step of the NASA space program, which was the Gemini space program. So the Mercury space program had 1 astronaut. Here we have the Gemini space program, which had 2 astronauts involved. So 2 astronauts would go inside the Gemini capsule. So think of the Mercury program as like the baby steps. And now we're going to see Gemini almost like an adolescent. They're starting to move around a lot more. They're going on longer orbits. The idea is to keep practicing and practicing and have the skills ready for astronauts to one day land on the moon, then return. So now we're going to see longer missions with these Gemini astronauts. We're going to see the Gemini space capsules actually dock with another type of spacecraft, because the idea when you're having the lander going down to the moon, you're going to have something leave and come back and attach. So they have to practice that with these Gemini capsules. And then these astronauts are spending a lot more time inside of their spacecraft here. So the Mercury missions, those space missions, were fairly short. But in this case, we're spending some time, like up to 2 weeks inside of a space capsule like this. If you look inside, look at this picture, you might not notice a lot of room here. You might not also notice a bathroom here. You also might not be noticing a kitchen. So everything that these astronauts have to do to live in space, they're figuring out a lot inside of the space capsule here, inside the Gemini space capsule. So Gus Grissom and John Young were actually one of the first astronauts to have a very important mission of pooping in space for the American space program. And this is something that they actually had to study and figure out if the effects were any different and if they could get the job done, and they were able to do so. Something else that these astronauts had to do is test some food items, because the idea is that you are spending more time in space. Your food has to provide you enough energy for what you have to do, and it has to last a very long time and be shelf stable, right? So unfortunately, at this time, a lot of the food that they had was in cubes or tubes, and they weren't too big fans of the food that they had with them. So what's interesting is Gus Grissom and John Young were pretty infamous for something that they brought to space with them. And that was a corned beef on rye sandwich up into space. And I want us to think about a delicious sandwich on Earth. Great, right? Bite into a sandwich. Think about what might happen as you're biting into that sandwich. Now think of some problems you might face if you're biting into that sandwich in space. Feel free to write that in the chat or the comments. Right, so on Earth, we have the gravity pulling those crumbs downwards, right? But in space, we have a microgravity environment. So what's going to happen with these crumbs is they're going to float around. This could be very dangerous for the astronauts and very dangerous for the equipment. So when Gus Grissom and John Young came back down to Earth, they actually had to apologize to Congress for bringing the sandwich into space, because things could have not gone so well. But thankfully, everything worked out for astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young on this mission. So speaking of food, luckily, when they returned to Intrepid, they received a very, very awesome cake here. So some lovely food on Earth. And then you can actually see these military sabers that they're cutting this cake with, because this cake is fairly large, and it's a bit of a Navy tradition to cut a very large cake with a very large knife, in this case, a sword. So after the Gemini missions, we have the Apollo missions, where Apollo spacecraft are making their way to the moon and back. So the very famous Apollo mission that landed on the moon Apollo 11 took place in 1969. After that, the United States went to the moon 5 more times. So in total, the United States went to the moon about 6 times. So 12 astronauts have been to the surface of the moon. So, but after that, the United States was kind of figuring out what is the next step. And the answer to that was the space shuttle. So we're looking at the space shuttle here, Space Shuttle Enterprise. Does anyone have, what are some things we noticed just looking at the Enterprise here? What are some things that we see? Feel free to write in the comments. I'll talk about Space Shuttle here in a bit. Or does anyone have any questions about anything we've covered so far? Okay, so we're looking at the Space Shuttle Enterprise here. And the Space Shuttle Enterprise is the very first space shuttle ever made. And Aaron noticed, yes, there are a lot of tiles here, a lot of tiles. So the purpose of these tiles is meant to absorb heat. So with these space capsules, when they are coming back down to Earth, they have what is called an ablative shield. So that shield kind of absorbs the heat and kind of starts to chip and melt away as it's making its way back to Earth's atmosphere, back through Earth's atmosphere, getting a lot of friction along the way, right? So there's an ablative shield there. In this case, these tiles are meant to absorb that heat. So we see these black tiles down below and these white tiles up above. You'll also notice that these tiles, the majority of the tiles, are in the front and at the bottom of the air of the spacecraft. That's because this is what would be experiencing that friction as the space shuttle is re-entering Earth's atmosphere. So Space Shuttle Enterprise is the very first space shuttle ever made. So 6 space shuttles were made, only 4 exist today. Enterprise is the very first one. Because Enterprise is the very first one, it actually did not go into space. Enterprise is the prototype for the remainder of the space shuttle missions. So Enterprise, while it did not go into space, went about 26,000 feet up in the air. And what it would do would be on the top of a very large Boeing 747, and it would be released. And it would go about 470 miles per hour, gliding down back to Earth. Because the idea of these space shuttles is that they would blast off. Let me share my plushy shuttle here. They'd blast off up into space with this entire shuttle stack here. We have this large orange fuel tank. This is a liquid fuel tank. We have these white solid rocket boosters on the side here. They would provide a lot of fuel and fire that would help the space shuttle push a lot down so it could shoot up into space. But then these solid rocket boosters would fall off, make their way back via parachute down into the ocean. Then we would have this liquid fuel tank would fall off once the fuel is expended and start to wear away and burn up in Earth's atmosphere. And then we would have the space shuttle orbiter orbit around the planet. And then when it has to make its way back down, it would glide down, almost like a big paper airplane. Some astronauts describe it as riding your favorite roller coaster, but then having to park it. That experience of having your space shuttle glide down. So Enterprise, like the tiles that you see here, are actually not the space-ready tiles on this level. But if we were to walk underneath the space shuttle, you would see these tiles here, which are actually the space-ready tiles. And the reason why the Space Shuttle Enterprise has these is shortly after the Columbia disaster, is that NASA wanted to find out what exactly happened to Columbia. And what they discovered is a piece of foam hit one of these tiles and left the space shuttle vulnerable in a certain area. So they wanted to see what kind of impact would create damage to the tiles in this way. So they actually tested this out with the Space Shuttle Enterprise. So it's really good to have a prototype handy because they can find out more information about the space shuttles and determine how they can even improve them over the wide period of time the space shuttles were being used. So these tiles that we see here are the real type of space, are the space-ready tiles. The rest of the tiles on this particular shuttle are just made of a foam that we see here. So the function of a space shuttle is a little different from a space capsule. Because the thing about space capsules is that they're great in going up and going far distances because they're attached to rockets. But I want you to think about how many times you think you can use a space capsule. Think of its journey, right? So it's shooting up into space. It's orbiting around a few times, and it's coming back down with an ablative shield. It's kind of burning up on its way back through Earth's atmosphere. Then it lands in the water, right? So these space capsules would only be used one time. And that was something that the United States wanted to fix. They wanted to have a reusable spacecraft. If you're looking at the name here, Enterprise, you might notice it's a familiar name, right? So the NASA originally wanted to call this very first space shuttle the Constitution, but fans of a particular TV show, Star Trek, wanted to call it Enterprise. So there was a lot of conversation during this time and sci-fi works that were being generated during this time about reusable spacecraft, a spacecraft that could just leave Earth and come right back and just land. So that is what NASA wanted to work on. So that is why we have space shuttles. The idea is that the space shuttle can blast off up into space and just glide down. And something else about the space shuttle is you might notice some hinges here. So you might notice some hinges on the side, and that's because space shuttles can open up, because space shuttles are pretty essentially space trucks. They can bring really big things up into space. So parts of the space station were brought up using space shuttles. Telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope was brought up, very large satellites and very large things. So about the size of an entire school bus could fit inside of a space shuttle like Enterprise here. So very large things were brought up. So we'd have 5 to 8 astronauts that could fit in the front, and all the stuff would be in the back. You might notice here there's actually some windows here, and there's no glass here. The reason why there are windows here is as the space shuttle is leaving Earth's atmosphere, all that air that would be inside this space, this area here where like pieces of technology or satellites and telescopes or parts of the space station would be, all that air would be taken out, and you don't have to worry about any extra weight on the space shuttles as it's leaving Earth. So I'm noticing a question here, and Aaron asked, why are some of the tiles made of foam versus the real thing? So was this part of refurbishing for this museum, or did this prototype never have all actual tiles? So Aaron, yes, the space shuttle Enterprise did not have all actual tiles ever during the time it was being used. That is because this never actually went into space. Each individual tile has a fairly large price point attributed to it. And because the space shuttle during early tests, NASA discovered that it had some structural designs that made it a little bit too heavy in certain areas. And considering that I just mentioned that NASA was concerned about extra air going up into space, NASA definitely did not want any additional weight going up into space that did not need to go up there. So they decided to just build a new space shuttle and use Enterprise as that prototype and as a test vehicle, as a way to test certain things. And in terms of why it had these tiles here, this is one of those tests, right, to determine what exactly happened to Columbia after that incident in 2003. Any other questions? All right, so we're looking at the space shuttle here, and space shuttles actually stopped being used in 2011. So So the very last space shuttle mission was STS-135 in 2011. And the reason why NASA stopped using these is because space shuttles can't go as high up as rockets can. And technology was starting to shift in what was needed to send supplies to the International Space Station, to send telescopes up into space. So NASA took a step back from space shuttles, and instead they started working on the next step, the next place where NASA wants to travel, and that is the Mars, right? So NASA is currently working on the Space Launch System with the Orion space capsule in hope to one day have astronauts return to the moon and have astronauts one day land on the surface of Mars. And that would be through a rocket, not through space shuttle technology that we see here. But without the space shuttle, the Space Launch System would not be possible because NASA learned a lot about rocket fuel, learned a lot about bringing very large objects up into space using the space shuttle, and countless other technological advancements through the space shuttle. So I want to bring us down to this level of the space shuttle pavilion here and look at another spacecraft. And is this spacecraft here? So what we're looking at here is a Soyuz space capsule. And this is a little bit different from the space capsules we looked before. I said that NASA is no longer using space shuttles to go up into space. They're developing their own space capsules. They're developed Orion space capsules to go to the moon and Mars again. In the meantime, NASA currently has another country help their astronauts go up into space, or private companies such as SpaceX help their astronauts go up into space. So in this case, the United States asked Russia for a seat inside of one of their space capsules to go up into space. And something really interesting about the Soyuz space capsule here is that Soyuz space capsules do not land in water. They actually land on land. So if you see here, this space capsule did go into space. You see the Ablative Shield a little burnt up on its way back down. And on its way towards the ground, what happens is these Soyuz space capsules have retro rockets that just around the time where a space capsule is about to make impact with the ground, retro rockets fire and creates a little bit of thrust for the space capsules, so the impact is not as severe. And there is still a very large parachute to help these astronauts or cosmonauts on their way back down. So Aaron asked a great question. Aaron asked, how is the space capsule acquired? So there was a time where there was a company that would allow civilians to go up into space. And one entrepreneur by the name of Gregory Olson was one of the 7 individuals during this period of time to actually make his way up into space. And he actually went up in this particular Soyuz space capsule. After he went up into space and into the International Space Station with this space capsule, he actually purchased this space capsule from from Russia, and then we have it on view at the museum here. So it was not acquired from Russia, it was acquired from Gregory Olson, who then provided it to the museum to be on view. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? I'm just going to stop my screen share for one moment, and I will take us to another highlight of the museum. If we don't have any more questions, I will actually take us to the flight deck, and we can look at some aircraft, maybe some related to space on the way. There we go. All right, so I'll end this tour by bringing us to the flight deck of Intrepid. For our friends who have visited Intrepid before, feel free to share an aircraft that you may want to check out right now. And if not, I might bring us to an aircraft that has a connection to space. In more ways than one. And it's this aircraft over here, the A-12. And some of us may be familiar with a plane by the name of the SR-71 Blackbird. That is the Air Force equivalent of this aircraft. This aircraft, the A-12, was built by Lockheed and was created by the CIA. And something about this aircraft, its connection to space, is this aircraft would go so fast and so high that the pilots inside would wear suits very similar to spacesuits as they were flying this aircraft and testing it out. The A-12 was created in 1961, so right around the time of the space race. And this plane goes extremely fast, about 2,200 miles per hour. So it could go around the world in just about, around the equator in just about 11 hours. Very, very impressive aircraft that we have here. Another connection to space, well, some may believe it's a connection to space, is that this aircraft was tested in a place called Area 51. And because it was tested in Area 51, people would see black blurs flying through the sky, going extremely fast, faster than the speed of sound. And some people thought it was UFOs. But in fact, it was the CIA testing out this aircraft, the A-12 here. Does anyone have any questions about this aircraft or about the flight deck? You might notice this aircraft doesn't have any weapons on it. Instead, this aircraft was for reconnaissance. So it had a very, very powerful camera located just underneath the pilot's cockpit. And it was able to take very, very high definition pictures of the ground below. So this was used during the Cold War. And something very interesting about this aircraft is the material that it's made out of. Because this aircraft would go so fast, this aircraft would go about 80,000 feet up in the air. And again, 2,200 miles per hour. Because it goes fast, so fast, aluminum, which most planes that we have in our collection are made out of aluminum. If this was made out of aluminum, it would not perform as well. So this aircraft is actually made out of titanium. But during the Cold War, it was really interesting where the United States got their titanium, because the United States doesn't have much titanium. But a country that did during this time was the Soviet Union. So the United States actually had some companies that purchased titanium, but the idea was to use this titanium for aircraft like the A-12 here. And what's interesting about this aircraft is it actually stretch as it's going at such a high speed. And there was one pilot who wanted to show exactly how warm it was inside of this plane as it's moving so fast. And he took a cheese sandwich and placed it on the window. And as he went the top speed of this aircraft, I believe a few of us can guess what might have happened to that cheese sandwich. Yes, it turned into a grilled cheese. All right, friends, does anyone have any questions before we go? It's almost time in the program. All right, if we do not have any questions, I thank you all so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please feel free to like and subscribe and follow us and find out about more of these live streams that we'll be doing. Our live streams on Fridays for the time being will generally be general tours of the museum, but please keep a look at our schedule. You can find all about aircraft restoration on the ship and ongoing programs that we have. The museum is now open as well in person, and we'd love to have you join us. So let me stop sharing this. I'm going to stay here just for a little bit. If anyone has any additional questions, thank you so much for joining us today.